In-depth journalism in the Memphis community, the Daily Memphian is of Memphis, not just in Memphis, and seeks to tell the stories of this city. TheDailyMemphian.com. Truth in place.
Welcome back to another edition of the Daily Memphian's Memphis Grizzlies podcast. This is your host, Grizzlies beat writer Drew Hill, joined as always by columnist Chris Herrington. We had the NBA draft, finally. We waited weeks for it, but it finally happened. The Grizzlies with a little bit of I don't want to call it a stunner because I think we probably could have seen it coming, but maybe not what everybody exactly expected. Maybe what Chris expected because he wrote a column about it prior to the draft. But they take Zach Edey, number 9 overall. They take Jaylen Wells in the second round. They also take Cam Spencer out of UConn in the second round. Chris, what is your initial reaction to the Grizzlies draft results from 2024?
Yeah, I'm a little surprised at the degree to which it's been taking us a surprise, or it was taking us a surprise, because to your point, I did in fact write a column 2 days before the draft. The headline: could the Grizzlies take Zach Edey at number 9? And that was not me coming out of nowhere. That's because it had been talked about most specifically by Jonathan Givony of ESPN Draft Express, who's one of the most plugged-in draft people. He had talked very specifically about the idea of if the Grizzlies weren't able to trade up for Donovan Clingan, that they would seriously consider Zach Edey at 9. In addition to that, Zach Edey had told you directly that there was mutual interest between him and the Grizzlies, which we published at the Daily Memphian weeks ago. And there had been multiple reports in other places that the Grizzlies had worked out Zach Edey and were interested in Zach Edey. And in terms of the idea of it was a reach, it's true that he was not in the top 10 on any of the major mocks, but he was like in the 11 through 15 range on several of them. So I to me, it wasn't that surprising by any stretch. It certainly seemed clear, and we can get more into this, it certainly seemed clear that they were, even though they haven't admitted this publicly, it seems very clear that they were trying to move up, presumably for Donovan Clingan. So drafting Zach Edey at 9 doesn't seem like it was really plan A, but it certainly feels like they had major interest in Zach Edey, and that wasn't out of the blue.
Yeah, let's talk Zach a little bit. I took some listener questions this morning over on X, so I do want to get to those. We got 2 other draft picks to talk about. I think bottom line, the context that I've gathered about this Zach Edey pick is obviously it addresses the front court, but I think part of the reason for the confidence and some of what Zach Kleiman expressed on draft night when he spoke is that the Grizzlies made this selection in part because they feel like not only does Zach Edey plug some holes that they might need and replace some of what Steven Adams did, but also the fact that by having somebody that is that big and is that, I guess, skilled in positioning and offensively being able to score in the post, and he showed that all the way through college, 2-time National Player of the Year, it creates a matchup problem. And they think that by taking a matchup problem to someone else versus having to react to what another team might do could be of use for them. And so in the end, I think that turned out to be a pretty important part of this pick, of this decision to go with Zach Edey. What are your thoughts about the fit, about the reasoning behind it, and about that way of thinking?
Well, they had a hole at center, and if they weren't able to fill that hole in draft or trade, it didn't feel like to me there were great options for them to fill it in free agency. So one of the things I'd been saying for weeks going up to the draft was that I felt like, and I think you and I agreed on this, that the best outcomes for the Grizzlies involved filling that center hole during the draft, whether that was a player in the draft or trade. And so they did that. And in Edey, they want to try to win right now. If Edey, you never know with rookies, but if any rookie is going to step in and help them, this is a 4-year college guy who was National Player of the Year 2 years in a row, just put up 37 in the national title game against Donovan Clingan. So, like, if he's going to be good at all, it seems like he's likely to be good pretty soon, And so there's that aspect to it. In terms of the fit, they've got a proof of concept. I mean, they've just employed Steven Adams and Jonas Valanciunas, and there are some similarities there. In fact, Jonas Valanciunas is one of the players that Edey has been compared to most, included by me, pretty early in the process. And the best attributes that Steven Adams had as a screener and rebounder are things that Edey seems particularly well suited to replicate at a very high level in the NBA. And so I thought everything Zach Kleiman said relative to the fit on both ends of the floor was more than solid. He sort of downplayed the bigger questions about the foot speed on defense, but everything he said about the fit, to me, makes sense. And the more I looked at it, I am increasingly bullish on Zach Edey being able to help the Grizzlies on offense. Not only Zach Edey being able to play well effectively for the Grizzlies on offense, but for Zach Edey to help boost the team's offense. And I go back to the Steven Adams thing, and I wrote about this a little bit earlier this week. It may have sort of got lost in past, it was so tight this week with all the stuff, it may have gotten a little bit lost in the mix. But if you go back and look at Steven Adams with the Grizzlies, the year and a half he was healthy for the Grizzlies, it's somewhat counterintuitive. But the Grizzlies, Steven Adams' presence helped the Grizzlies more on offense than it did on defense. The Grizzlies' offense was pretty dramatically better with Adams on the floor versus without him on the floor, even though he didn't score much at all and couldn't shoot. And that's because there's a lot of reasons for that, but the two big ones are his screening and his offensive rebounding. His screening was so effective for John Morant and for others, and he was so dominant on the offensive glass, and that got them so many extra opportunities. To me, Zach Edey can step in pretty quickly and replicate that screening and offensive rebounding function that Steven Adams had. And I don't think he's the passer Steven Adams was, but he does lots of other stuff better. He's a better free throw shooter. He's a better finisher. He's more of a lob target above the rim. He's a guy who you can go to in the post, obviously, although I think he'll do that less. So I think he's going to fit really well offensively. To me, the question for him is going to be on the defensive end. Are teams able to target him and stretch out the floor and attack him and pick and roll and basically, make his defense more of a hurt than his offense as a help.
Two more Edey things I want to touch on before we move on to other guys. One is the reaction, which I'm choosing not to overreact to the reaction because, as I said on Twitter, I do not think that the social media response to these things always reflects the general fan base's response to some of these things, because usually that's the most outspoken parts of the fan base. I think there are a lot of people that are excited about Zach Edey being a Grizzly, but there are some doubts, and I think some of those doubts are fair. Like you mentioned, the foot speed, the fit. He obviously, the game he played in college is going to be a lot different than the game that he's going to play in Memphis. He was a big time back to the basket, post up, go score for us type of guy. He's going to be asked to do more of that, or more than that, I should say, with the Grizzlies. So, but I did a story. I almost immediately reached out to some folks at IMG, and Zach played there for 2 seasons. And when he arrived there, he had only played basketball for 1 year. I think that's an important thing, to note, is that this is a player that has grown tremendously over a very short period of time. Somebody that really didn't even know how to play basketball, 6 years ago, and now is a 2-time National Player of the Year. It's pretty impressive. And I do think that should not be overlooked when thinking about this Edey pick and some of the questions that go along with it. I also, one thing that didn't get included in the IMG piece was that he has to be coached a little differently according to his former coaches, and Purdue found a way to really coach him and make him really effective. Memphis is going to have to do the same, but they're not going to have to center everything around Zach Edey, which I think is definitely a benefit here. So, I think all of those things are important context. Things to keep in mind when it comes to Zach is like, this guy still hasn't even played basketball for that long. And I know he's a little bit older, but I do think that there is room, and there's a track record and a history of when he is questioned, he has responded to that and made himself a useful player and made it work out.
So I like the Edey pick in part because I think the fit is generally good. I've been higher on him as a player. I think that he's been on like mocks and stuff really all season. Unlike a lot of these guys, I watched him play actual basketball games, and I thought some of the Boban Marjanovic, excuse my mispronunciation, comps were silly. I mean, watching him play, and in part I like it because I'm not really crazy about the draft, right? I mean, they didn't take him at number 3 in a good draft. They took him at number 9 in a shaky draft. I will say, for people who doubt the pick, those people may be right.
They could be.
They could be totally right about this. That's not the degree that I have an issue with some of the negative feedback on it. It's not that I think the people are the people who don't like the pick are going to be wrong. I do think they're going to be wrong, but they may be right. The two issues I have are, one, the certainty that some people have, where they just insist that of course this won't work, as if they can see into the future and they know exactly. I mean, the level of certainty that people will convey about the future of young basketball players who haven't played in the NBA yet, it's a little much for me sometimes. There's a lot of that with this pick. And then the other thing is that, with the exception of, I guess, been out of shape University of Tennessee fans who wanted the Grizzlies to take Dalton Knecht, and that's
crazy.
Part of it.
That was crazy.
But just let me make this point. But other than that sliver of people who do have a very specific person in mind they wanted the Grizzlies to pick, a lot of the criticism of the Edey pick is not followed up by this is who they should have picked. It's not like in the past we've had this. Like, how could you pick Tony Roten when you could have had Draymond Green? Or how could you pick Hasheem Thabeet when you could have had Tyreek Evans or James Harden? Like, these things happened in the moment in past Grizzlies drafts. How could you take, Jordan Adams when Rodney Hood was there? I don't hear the follow-up for most, other than the Connect stuff. I don't hear the follow-up for most people. Like, how could you blow it with this Edey pick instead of? People don't seem to have a great idea of what the other option should have been.
To play devil's advocate, people would say instead of just forcing the trade to go get Klingon.
Well, yeah, no, that's a different thing we can get into. But I'm saying once that doesn't happen, and you're at 9, people don't seem to have this clear idea of like this would have been a better pick, and that's part of my comfort with it. Is you can take the next 3 guys drafted, I believe, in some order, were Cody Williams, Modest Buzelis, and who was the other guy? So Cody Williams went 10, Modest Buzelis went 11, Nikola Topic went 12. So those are the next 3. Topic apparently is just not going to play basketball this season, and even if he were a project. Those are 3 players who, they could all be better than Zach Edey, but there's a very good chance none of them would have been in the Grizzlies rotation this season, and they're trying to win right now. And so, to me, just the absence of some obvious other player to pick who made sense, to me, made me even more comfortable with it.
I'm a proud University of Alabama graduate, so I know people will call Homer on this. But listen, on the Tennessee stuff, that's just weird to me. Like, do you not understand how the NBA draft works?
Yeah.
You're supposed to take the best player that can help you right now. Like, and maybe Dalton Knecht turns out to be a better player than Zach Edey, but like, no franchise is going to be like, maybe besides the Lakers taking the USC guy, but no franchise is going to take a player just because they played college basketball in the state. And by the way, the Grizzlies have taken Tennessee players in the past, so I just don't understand it.
As Parker Fleming pointed out, they took a Tennessee player in Memphis Native Jarrell Stokes and a pick that they could have used of Nikola Jokic, I mean, the Grizzlies have taken Memphis players in the past, and it has not worked out for them. And so, that's a particularly dumb sliver of stuff that it's not that many people, but I'm surprised at how much of it I saw. The other thing that's weird about that to me, and I'm sorry if I'm going to annoy Tennessee fans that are listening to us, but like Knoxville is like a world away from Memphis, by the way. I know it's in the same state, but it's like another universe. It's very far away, and Dalton Knecht was there for 1 year. This is not like some lifelong Tennessee legend or something. It's not like the Grizzlies passed on Penny Hardaway or something. I mean, whatever.
It's just it's just bizarre.
He also went 17th, by the way.
It was the fact too that it was Tennessee media members that were upset, and I understand that their allegiances may lie to their Tennessee players, but like, that's just not how the draft works. Like, the Bears aren't going to take the quarterback who plays at Illinois when Caleb Williams is on the board. Like, if you just don't, like, that's not how it works. But anyway, We can move on from that. The
Yeah.
only other piece on Edey that I wanted to get to is like, we were wondering if this pick would reflect the direction of the franchise, and like, somebody tweeted at me to say to delete the LaRoche 5-out pieces because they picked a guy like Edey, which I got a good chuckle at, and that's that's a fair chirp. I'll acknowledge a fair chirp, but like I still think that's interesting stuff, right? Like the way that they were going to
Well,
put this
yeah.
isn't necessarily defined.
Yeah, let me make a point on this. I have not written about this aspect of it. This does signal that the Grizzlies, are not done with big centers, and that they're not ideological about we will only play one way. In fact, they very directly say we want to be able to play multiple ways. But that 5-out is one of the ways they want to play. And the idea of being able to deploy Jaren Jackson Jr. at center with other configurations and play more like that is something they very much will do and do want to do. But the other thing about this is, and Zach Kleiman didn't go out on too much of a limb about this on draft night, as he shouldn't have. And it's, we'll see. This is a longer term proposition. But they haven't discarded the notion that Zach Edey will stretch out his shot in that Brooke Lopez kind of way, right? That's not something that's going to happen day one, but that's something over time I do think they will look at. He is a 70% free throw shooter. He does have good touch. He was not asked to shoot. He didn't at Purdue. I mean, he's dominating the paint. They didn't need him shooting threes, right? I do think over time they will try to cultivate that part of his game. And, to have that Brooke Lopez set shot three in his arsenal. I do think they'll try to develop that.
Kleiman didn't promise that he would shoot, but he didn't want to rule it out either.
It's an overtime thing, but I think they will actively try to develop that part of his game over time.
Yeah. I found that to be interesting, and good for you for sneaking in an ideological in there in that answer.
Oh, I wasn't even trying. There we go.
That was really good. Good usage by you. Okay, second round, they take Jaylen Wells out of Washington State. A really fascinating player. Played at Division II for 2 seasons before getting to Washington State. Quick riser, has good size. Shot the ball really well, like 41.7% from 3, and on close to 5 attempts. So pretty good. What do you make of that draft selection? I take it you liked that one because you had him as one of the 5th round options.
It's not so much that I liked it, it's that I sort of sniffed it out. I'd never seen him play basketball. So this was not me saying these are guys I like. I was trying to guess who the Grizzlies might like. And so as it so happens, I did write a thing earlier this week. It was not the lead of a column. It was tucked at the very bottom of some other column. But I did a little exercise where I tried to sort of guess who they might like in the second round. And at the end of it, I threw darts for 5 players. I mentioned 5 players that I was going to keep an eye on in the second round for the Grizzlies. Jaylen Wells is one of those, and Cam Spencer was another. So I hit both of those. They're both shooters. Wells is a shooter with good size, not great size, but good size. I mean, he would increase the size of the Grizzlies, wing rotation a little bit. I think he's bigger than Conchar. He's bigger than Kennard. He's bigger than Vince Williams, at least taller. And they need both of those things. Wells is also someone who he didn't pop on everybody's rankings, but I did note that Kevin Pelton, who does sort of a partially stats-based projection, he had Wells rated 22nd in the draft. And so that's another thing that made me that popped him, on my radar.
Yeah, we're going to have a lot of time to talk about these guys the rest of the summer, so I don't want to spend too much time. But Cam Spencer, another guy who had good shooting numbers in college, did a little bit of everything for UConn, is like a fierce competitor. I think that might be understating it. Like, is it in your grill like type of guy? And I think he's got a little bit of crazy in the good way. And we lost Dylan Brooks in Memphis, so maybe we'll get a little bit of crazy back with Cam Spencer if he sees the floor. What did you make of that pick, and what do you think? Where do you think he is on the roster? And Wells, I guess. What do we think of the roster spots there?
I don't know if either of these things have been fully determined, but I would be extremely surprised if Jaylen Wells is not on the 15-man roster and Cam Spencer is not on a 2-way. To me, where they got picked, pretty much, if you're picked in the 40s, it's sort of a question mark which way it could go. If you're in the top 40, you're not going to be on a 2-way. In fact, I'm pretty sure that has never happened. I don't think if someone picked in the 30s has ever been on a two-way. It'll probably happen at some point, but it's never happened before, I'm pretty sure. And, if you're picked in the 50s in the NBA now, you're almost certainly going to be on a two-way, if that. And so I think it's close to certain that Jaylen Wells will be on the main roster and Cam Spencer will be on a two-way. I got no idea on Cam Spencer. I have seen him play. Great college player, fun guy to watch. He's 24 years old. He's like 6'3". He's not a great athlete. Great shooter, plays hard, good feel for the game. But but can you crack through all the other stuff, to become an NBA player? Some guys do. Sam Merrill, who had a cup of coffee.
TJ McConnell.
Yeah, but he's an on-ball guy. He's a point guard. I would point to Sam Merrill, who's another 6'3", 6'4" shooter, who was just such a good shooter that he's broken through and he got a lot of minutes for the Cavs last season. If I'm Cam Spencer and I'm looking for a model for me, it's more Sam Merrill than TJ McConnell, because I just don't think he's going to do stuff on the ball or defend the way TJ McConnell does.
Yeah. Okay. We can move on from that. I did take some questions earlier today, so I'm going to pull those up right now, and we can go through a few of them. All right. First question. This comes from Steven. What exactly did the Grizz give up to move up to take Spencer?
So I don't know the precise answer on that, and it's so complicated. I honestly don't care, and I don't think you say Steven, I don't think you should care about this, or any fan should either. It was some kind of like heavily protected partial claim on some distant future second round pick. It is something of no consequence, and no one needs to worry about it.
Okay. Also from Steven, will the Grizzlies make a move for a veteran big? Is Wiseman a possibility? Not trying to be a homer, just think he still has some potential and isn't a bust, and Golden State and Detroit were bad fits. I don't think you're signing James Wiseman. Maybe. Yeah, I think you can't 100% roll it out, but it seems very unlikely. He hasn't worked out anywhere yet.
Yeah, I'd be very surprised on first Wiseman. I do think, if you had unlimited roster spots, I think you could definitely use another big. If you look at this roster, they have four true front court players on the roster. They began last season with 6. I think ideally you would want a fifth front court player for depth. You don't have a roster spot for it right now, but you can certainly create one. And if they created a roster spot or two, I think that is one area where they would look. And so, yeah, I could see them adding a veteran big as the 5th front court player. The one thing now is that because Edey is, I think, pretty likely to be your starting center, it's I think they're going to be less willing to spend on that slot, but you're not looking at a potential starter. You're looking at a true 5th big. And I think free agents, it's less attractive for them to come now, right? Some of the names we've talked about, Andre Drummond, Jalen Smith, Goga Badatse, those would be good guys to have as a 5th big, and maybe that's what they should be. That's not what they're looking for. They're looking for a better opportunity than that. So I do have a column that went up as we write, where I threw out a few names, but I don't have a great feel for who that might be.
Okay, this is from Michael. Are the Grizzlies doubling down on youth again? I have one point I would like to make on this.
Yeah.
And while they are, going back to youth in the draft, this is a little bit of a different situation from when they doubled down on youth the first time, because Zach Edey, when compared to Zaire Williams as draft prospects, to me are entirely different players, like way different. And so when they moved off of Anderson and Melton and they went with this new group, some of those players that they were taking were players that they were drafting based on potential. And I do think that some of that exists with Edey as well. So I'm not saying that they totally didn't double down on youth again, because in a way they did. I just think that the players are so different. You should be more confident in what Edey can bring you right away than what any of those other guys, Roddy, Laravia, Williams, like any of those guys would have brought you right away.
Yeah, there's certainly a limit to a comparison between those two off seasons. One, that off season, they brought in 5 rookies total. It was Roddy, Laravia, Kennedy Chandler, Vince Williams Jr., Kenneth Lofton Jr. So they brought in 5 total rookies for the 18, I think it was actually 17-man roster at the time. They brought in 5. Right now they're bringing in 3. They brought in 2 first-round rookies expected to actually play real minutes. This time they're bringing in 1. And that one is a guy who was a 4-year college player, drafted in the top 10, who was the 2-time player of the year. And again, if he's going to be good, he may be good pretty quick. And so there is a limit to that. That said, you do only have so many roster spots. You are trying to win right now, and you're going to use 2 of those roster spots on rookies. And there's a decent chance we can get into this. Maybe there's a decent chance you're going to let a notable veteran and Luke Kennard walk. And so I do think if the team loses from this point forward today, as we speak, if the team loses a veteran without adding a meaningful veteran, much less like adding more than they currently have, I do think that the front office is going to hear that did we need to double down, triple down, whatever on youth? I do think that quote will be thrown back at them by some people.
Okay, I'm going to combine 2 questions here, one from Leslie and one from Henry. Leslie asks, how do you see the fit between Jaren Jackson and Edey working offensively? There's been a lot of talk about, their defensive synergy, but how do you think they work offensively? And Henry asks, realistically, who do you think will be able to play at the 4 with Edey besides Jaren? I think those 2 kind of go together a little bit.
Yeah, these are both fantastic questions. And they're the kind of questions that, I'm probably going to write 3,000 words about in a few months.
You hear that? Henry and Leslie, you just got the question stamp of approval from Chris Herrington. That is hard. That is challenging. If you ever listen to Chris on the radio, he's always criticizing Jeff of his questions. So for him to come out and say these are fantastic questions, credit to you for asking these 2.
Yeah. I mean, we're only going to explore these questions so much here on the pod, but just for starters, the idea of the Jaren-Zach pairing offensively is interesting because it's easy to see how Jaren will help Zach Edey, right? Because Jaren can stretch the floor, that helps Edey sort of cook as the pick and roll guy, as the post up guy, whatever. The problem with that is you're elevating the lesser player, and we just saw Jaren Jackson Jr. Increase his ability to score as a go-to guy, as a self-creator, operating in space. And so you don't want to take too much of that away from Jaren because now, he's tied to this more paint-bound center. So I think, that's something they're going to have to work out. They're not going to play together all the time. They're going to be split up over the course of 48 minutes. And maybe, Jaren has more time to cook when Edey's on the bench and vice versa. But they are going to have to find ways to utilize Edey when Jaren, the offense is running more through Jaren, in the darker spot, whatever. But that is going to be a trick for Taylor Jenkins. And as far as, and you may have thoughts on this too, but just real quick on the second question from Henry, the question of front court combinations is an interesting one. And to me, I would rephrase the question a little bit of what will work for them that does not include Jaren, because Jaren works with everybody. And Zach Kleiman talked about that. He talked about Jaren and Zach Edey, that's one look, and Jaren that we like, and Jaren and Brandon Clark's a look that we like, and Jaren and Santi Aldama's a look that we like, and maybe Jaren and Gigi Jackson will be a look that they like. What works that does not include Jaren? To me, that is the real question. I don't know if Edey can play with Brandon Clark.
I would guess that Edey and Brandon Clark would I'm not trying to be negative here, but would not be the best combination because Brandon Clark has worked the best with Jaren.
Yeah, but Jaren can't play 48 minutes. That's my point. If Edey and Clark doesn't work because there's no spacing, if Edey and Santi doesn't work because they're both susceptible defensively, I think Santi and Brandon Clark works okay, but that's a real potential problem they have. They have all these different front court looks that they like, but they all involve having to play Jaren Jackson Jr.
I would agree. One thing I'm going to add on this is that on the first point about their synergy offensively, I think you do raise a good point here that maybe you're playing to Edey's strengths rather than playing to Jaren's strengths. But Jaren did work with Steven Adams, and I do think that at least with Edey, he was a good enough free throw shooter in college that you could talk yourself into, I think, relatively easily him being able to make that elbow jumper more often than a guy like Steven Adams did. And if Edey's coming to the top of the key to set screens and you're setting up possessions for Jaren on the inside, I think that there's a lot of, opportunity there. And I think that potentially it could work better if you wanted to try to talk yourself into something like that.
Yeah, I mean, Edey, we don't know how much Edey's going to shoot, but we know he's going to shoot more than Steven Adams, because Steven Adams wouldn't even take jump shots, period, or wouldn't even attempt them. And so I do think it's key long-term for Edey, and for the Edey and Jaylen fit. I think it's important long-term for Edey to develop himself into at least a shooting threat from the perimeter, hopefully from three-point range, but also, to your point, the elbow jumpers will help too. And then B, to let's see what he can do as a passer. And that these are two things that there's no evidence he is good at either of these things, but he had no opportunity to do these things at Purdue. And he was so dominant down low, and that's, they just put him down low and let him dominate. And so he has not had the opportunity to sort of grow and flash those parts of his game.
Question about Luke. Is it becoming more likely they restructure Luke's contract? Any chance Smart comes off the bench in favor of Vince or Gigi? Let's start with the Luke thing, and I think that's a big question there. Now,
what do you think?
Now they're in the position where if you pick up the option, you're over the first apron, and it doesn't make a ton of sense to me to go right over. And I think that if you were to decline the team option and use the mid-level exception, you can get yourself under the tax. I know that there's you don't want to be, because in the future, if more contracts are coming, there is a repeater tax, right? That's in play here as well. So there's a lot of things in play. I think right now that it is more likely, if they pick up that option, it's more likely they're going to trade. And I think right now, if they were to decline the option, that they're going to be under the tax. And that's another question we got, by the way. Are the Grizzlies going to dodge the tax? I think right now I would probably guess that they'll be under the tax. That's my guess.
I think I agree with everything you said in terms of, the likely paths. And, if you do this, this is more likely. If you do this, and then ultimately what's more likely. So I think I agree with everything you just said there. I wrote about this today. People can go read a little bit more because it's up on the site as we talk. But I'm a little torn on this question. I think the repeater tax thing is a real thing, but I almost wonder if that's a little bit more of a boogeyman than a real monster as far as the Grizzlies go. To trigger the repeater tax, you have to be into the tax in 3 years out of 4. And I think with the cap rising and, Jaren's contract's going to decline again next season, and Brandon Clark's contract is even. And to me, I could see them being in the tax this season, dipping down next season. And I don't know how much I fear the repeater tax. On the other hand, there is a real question of what is the value of being in the tax. If you're in the tax with Luke Kennard as your 5th, and if Gigi Jackson pops, maybe 6th most important perimeter player, versus you're out of the tax and you're replacing Luke Kennard with, say, a 5th big who you're paying $5 million a year to, who's also useful to you. Is the difference between those two things worth being in the tax? I think that's a legitimate counterpoint to make. But I do think at some point saying we are building for a title and not being in the tax is going to come in conflict in the NBA. And so to me, this is a reasonable criticism for people to make, even though the team would also have reasonable responses to it.
Okay, a couple more. We may not have time to get to all of these today. What kind of deals can the Grizzlies make to consolidate the back end of the roster, in particular the wing long jam?
I think one of my questions I have is how close to, and it's not positive value, but and I don't think it's even neutral, but how close to neutral value does Zaire Williams have on the trade market? Because if you look at some of these trades that have happened this week, Denver had to send 3 second-round picks to Charlotte to make Reggie Jackson's $5 million contract disappear. Dallas, I think, sent 3 second-round picks to Detroit to get rid of the bigger contract of Tim Hardaway. Now, they got Quentin Grimes back in the process. That's a little bit different. But if you just want to get off money, you got to pay for it. And I don't know how much the Grizzlies want to pay to, say, get off a Zaire Williams contract. Zaire Williams is still young. He is still athletic. his contract will come with restricted free agent rights for the team that has him, whether that's the Grizzlies or someone else. Can you move him to a rebuilding team without having to pay much to do it? I think if that's the case, I think you're probably going to see that happen, just because they're too crowded at that position, and they're too crowded now at that position with unproven guys. You're talking about Vince Williams, Gigi Jackson, Zaire Williams, Jake LaRavia, Sean Conchar, Jaylen Wells. That's a lot of young wings who have never done it in playoff basketball before. It just feels like too much.
We have time for just maybe one or two more. How likely is it that the current roster is the opening day roster?
Oh, I think it's unlikely that the current roster is the opening day roster, but I would expect minimal change, right? To me, I look at just what we've been talking about. I look at the Luke Kennard slot. I look at the Zaire Williams slot. And I suspect one or both of those players is not final roster and was replaced with some other lower level signing or trade acquisition. But I don't expect a lot of change either in quantity or quality. What do you think?
I don't expect a lot of change either. I do think that, obviously they're on a roster crunch. So I think that, yeah, there's potential that they move off of somebody, as you were just discussing. In terms of additions, there's other questions here about could they add to the front court again? It's a possibility, but I think you would want to solve your roster crunch in that process as well. So I think that something will happen, this summer before we get to the start of the season.
One name that I don't think we mentioned on the pod, and it's low level stuff, but we're here to explore all the nooks and crannies. Trey Jemison right now is on that third two-way. And so do they think that like Scottie Pippen Jr., he can be a guy who gives them real minutes when they need it next season? If they don't, do they look to add someone a little bit more polished as the front court? They're basically going to carry Scottie Pippen Jr. as a kind of, often used backup point guard on a two-way. Do they try to find a more usable fifth big and keep him on the two-way because of their roster spot crunch? I liked Trey Jemison last year, so maybe he'll be back. But it wouldn't surprise me if they were looking around for someone a little bit more polished in that spot.
Yeah, I wonder that too. I'm going to rapid fire try to answer a few of these. Any guesses on the number Edey will wear with 15 already taken? And will he fit in Ja's shoe size? My guess is 33.
I think I heard someone say 14.
Okay, 14. I like 14. That's my birthday.
Is it 33 Marc Gasol?
Oh, didn't think about that. I just went to high school number Zach Edey.
Yeah. I think Marc Gasol is 33, and that's retired.
So that's not going to be an option. Will he fit in the Ja ones? I don't know. Probably going to have to get a special pair made for that.
I think Nike has the technology for that.
Yeah. Real quick, if Memphis does decline Luke, can they sign him back with a non-taxpayer MLE?
They can sign him back. They don't need the non-taxpayer MLE or any other thing. You can decline a contract option without renouncing your free agent rights. So they would still have the rights to re-sign him as their own free agent, even if they decline the contract. You don't need to use any exceptions for that. That's unlikely to happen, but it could happen.
Edey good, Edey bad. I think I'll speak for both Chris and I. We both think Edey will be good. Yep. But up in the air. We'll see. We'll see how he plays. One last thing on Edey is we don't know if he's going to play in Summer League tonight. They're going to introduce him down at FedEx Forum. He could be on the Canadian Olympic roster, so that could could impact what happens this summer, but I don't think anything is set in stone. Zach didn't have any information on that when he got asked about it after the draft. So we will see. We will see what happens with that. And I think a lot of people hope he's in Summer League, but can't deny wanting to be an Olympian. That would be a pretty cool thing if he was able to do that for Team Canada. Well, that is going to do it for us this week. As always, we appreciate you listening. Go read our stuff over at the Daily Memphian. Go listen to the other Daily Memphian podcasts. But for Drew and for Chris, we're out of here.